Okay, now we're going to talk a little bit about lists and tables. We're going to touch on these just briefly. Sometimes there's content that doesn't fit nicely into paragraph tags, and especially that is true of lists of things and of tables, data that's presented in tabular form. So we're going to see how to do that in HTML. So maybe let's make a list of things I like about my phone. I'll just do it in text to start with. Let's see, I'll do it after my phone. I'll have a new heading. So let's start with just making a quick list. All excellent things. Now, I could go through the hassle of saving this and displaying it in the browser, but you know what's going to happen if I do. This is all just going to run along as one line. It's bad because it needs to be, it's not in any block. It should be in a paragraph, if nothing else. Right now it's just sitting out there as plain text. What we are going to do is make it into a UL. And the UL here. There we go. So now we have a UL, an unordered list. Unordered list. Let's see what that does to it. Refresh. These are things, it's shiny, it's fast, it makes phone calls. That has, all that's done right now is indented it. That's no good at all. The reason is because these are still, remember, white space doesn't matter. So just because we put the whole thing in something, that's good. It needed to be in something, but we haven't indicated what these are. Now we could put breaks in here, but again, we really want to avoid that break, and that's not really what this is in this case. These are each list items. That is, they're items in the list. So there's a list item. There's a list item, there's a list item, and each of these needs to close, of course. So now we've said this whole thing is a UL, and you can see the dotted line here because of the browser saying this is all together. And then we have three items, list items, that make up the unordered list. We'll save it, we'll refresh, and now we have a list. And that's all there is to a list. So this is what an unordered list, a UL, looks like. If we want to, we can change this to an ordered list, OL. You then have to close it as an OL, of course. An OL instead of a UL looks like this. It has numbers because it's ordered rather than having bullet points. That's it. Again, don't get too focused on the bullet points. You can change that in the presentation layer. In fact, you'll find we'll be spending a lot of time with lists because one of the most popular ways to make a menu bar these days is to include the menu items in a list and then style that list so that it looks like a bar or a menu instead of like a traditional list. So that's kind of I would say that's on the more extreme side of changing the recommended presentation. You take a set of list items and you say, well, sure, a menu is a list of items, obviously. When you have a menu in a restaurant or something, it's a list of items. But a menu for a website where you have a bar going across the top or down the side can be listed in the HTML as a menu and then reformed as something that looks a little bit different once it gets it to the presentation level. All right, so that's our list of things. Next, we're going to move on to tables. I'm trying to avoid the history here. I'm not talking about font tags or the bold tag, for example, things that are now deprecated, that is no longer used. But I will mention just briefly, before we had this separation between HTML and CSS, between presentation and content, one of the ways you forced the browser into presenting things in multiple columns, for example, was to use a table. That's no longer a sort of acceptable way of doing layout. You really ought to be doing all of the layout within CSS. But there are still times when you need to use a table, and the appropriate use of a table is for presenting a table items in tabular form. So, for example, if we have a comparison between the Droid and the iPhone, it's pretty obvious that we would lay that out in a table, and we wouldn't want to do that as an image, because we want to avoid images whenever we can. We'd want to do that in a table in HTML. So let's see how we would do that. We'll add in a new heading called compared. And again, let's just write out what it'll look like in text first. So we want to have something that is the iPhone versus the Droid. And we'll start with Carrier, T-Mobile, versus Verizon. Maker is Apple versus OS is iPhone. Keyboard. One of the things we need to do to make it a table, probably this is obvious, is we need to start with the table tag, and we need to end with the table tag. So everything between this is part of the table. Again, this is still white space, so we need to delineate each of these little pieces. So we're going to start off with a TR for each of the rows. So TR is for table row. And of course, each of those rows needs to be closed. That means an ending row. So there we go. Now we have a table with rows listing each of the rows with an opening and a closing. Go ahead and save that and see where we're at. Still, this doesn't look right. In fact, it's not even making them into rows. And the reason is that rows aren't made up of plain text. They're made up of what are called TDs. Again, this is like A. I really wish the TDs were easy to remember. They're table data cells, but that's not exactly useful. So there's the start of the next table data cell, and here's the end of it. Here's the start of this one, and the end of it. So to see what this is, it's a start of the row, start of the element, data cell, start of the data cell, start of the data cell. We need to do that for each of these, which is going to take a while, but we'll do it real quick. We'll do one there, and there, and there, and there. There. Now up here I haven't been doing it because these are actually not data cells. They're part of the header, which is an unusual difference. So we're going to do, first of all, there's nothing in that first one. TH. We'll end the table header cell. TH. And we'll end it. Alright, let's see how that looks. Ah, this is looking a lot more like it should look. We've got the headers are bolded in this case. Again, that's the browser's choice. It's by default, but it's taken those, and it has a layout, and it says each of the items and each of the items in a little box. Fits it all together and makes it into a nice little table for us. Now, again, ideally we'd want probably lines in here. We might want to space it out a bit. Those are all presentation issues. Those are all issues that we need to let the browser decide, or that we need to suggest to the browser, in fact, in terms of what we want that table to look like. But that is not our role here. Our role here is to say, this is a table and these are the pieces of it. I've identified the pieces of it for you. Use these pieces for that. There are some other items that go in along those lines. For example, there is, as part of the table, an attribute called summary. So we can put in that. You can also, inside the tag, but not inside any of the rows or any of the data cells, put in a caption. So let's do that real quick. Is better. Caption. So we'll save that real quick. Take a look. Now note that the caption just kind of goes there centered over the top by default. Again, it's a presentation issue. We're not going to worry about it. The summary, because it's an attribute, doesn't actually show up on the screen. But again, this is so that different machines can make use of that data in various ways. And so it allows us to summarize that. All right, so that's it for now. We're going to return to both of these, and especially to lists when we talk about presentations. But now you know how to put lists on the site and encode them properly. See you next time.